The rain had turned the city into a blur of silver streaks against the tall windows of the Smith estate. Thunder rumbled low in the distance, and the polished marble floors reflected the faint glow of lightning. Inside the mansion, silence ruled like a tyrant. The silence wasn't comforting, no soft hush of snowfall or peaceful quiet of a library. It was a silent weighted with grief, pressing down on every wall, corridor, and breath. William Smith, who owned the estate, had grown used to this suffocating silence. For months, it had been his only companion since his wife Rebecca had passed away. Once his house had been filled with music and laughter, Rebecca singing to the boys, the twins giggling as they raced down the long hallways, but now there was nothing. Only echoes, only absence. That night, William returned home later than usual. His driver had pulled up the car at the grand entrance, and William had stepped out into the storm, his tall frame rigid under the weight of his soaked coat. His jaw was clenched, his eyes heavy from exhaustion, and the glass of scotch he had abandoned at his office. He had spent the day pretending in boardrooms and investor meetings, hiding behind the familiar armor of power. But when he came home, there was no armor strong enough to protect him from what waited here. Memories he could not erase, sons he did not know how to reach, a house too vast for one heart. He pushed open the double doors and walked inside. The butler. Harold nodded in greeting, but William waved him off, shaking rainwater from his coat. He wanted to be alone, as he always did. He tried to bury himself in paperwork or drown in whiskey until the weight in his chest eased for a moment. But as he climbed the staircase toward the main bedroom, something unusual caught his attention. A light glowed faintly under the door, though he was certain he had turned it off that morning. His brows knit together. The boys had been restless for weeks, waking in the middle of the night with screams and tears, and their new nanny had been struggling to keep up. Still, William expected their rooms to be separate from his. His sanctuary was his own. He reached for the doorknob, his patience already fraying from the storm outside and the storm within. He pushed the door open and froze. "What the hell do you think you're doing in my bed?" His voice cracked the silence like a whip. The sight before him felt like a violation. On his bed, Rebecca's bed, their bed, lay a woman. She was curled on her side, her dark curls resting against the pillow. On either side of her were his sons Ethan and Eli, their small bodies nestled against her as if she were their shield. Their chests' soft rise and fall betrayed how deeply they were asleep. One of them clutched a teddy bear. The other's thumb rested in his mouth. The woman stirred at his voice, jerking awake. Her eyes widened, not with guilt, but with shock. "Mr. Smith," she began, her voice hushed, as if afraid to wake the boys. He cut her off, rage boiling in his veins. "Please answer me. What the hell are you doing in here?" She sat up slowly, her hands raised slightly open, a calm gesture. "They wouldn't sleep, sir. They begged me not to leave. Eli had a nosebleed, and Ethan was shaking. I stayed until they calmed." Her name surfaced in his mind. Nora Johnson. The nanny Harold had insisted on hiring last month, after the others had all quit. She was soft-spoken, polite, and apparently too bold for her own good. He had tolerated her presence only because the agency had run out of alternatives, and his sons needed someone. But now, she was in his bed, in Rebecca's bed. His fury blurred his judgment. "You think this is acceptable? To crawl into my bed as if you belong here? They asked me." She tried again, but the words were cut short. In a flash of uncontrolled anger, his hand came down hard across her cheek. The sharp crack echoed off the high walls, followed by heavy silence, suffocating the air. Nora staggered back, her hand flying to her face, her eyes wide with shock. She did not cry out. She did not shout. She only stared at him, stunned more by the act than the pain. "You're fired!" William growled, his chest heaving. "Get out! Now!" The twins stirred. Eli whimpered softly, his lips trembling. Still tender from the earlier bleed, Ethan's nose twitched as if he were about to wake. Nora glanced at them quickly, her expression torn. Her voice, when it came, was soft, almost a whisper. "They begged me not to leave them." I said, "Get out." For a long moment she stood still, her hand pressed to her cheek, her eyes never leaving his. Then slowly she leaned over, kissed the top of each boy's head, first Eli, then Ethan, and rose to her feet. She slipped her shoes into her hand and walked toward the door. She passed William without a word, without a glance. Downstairs, Mrs. Keller, the housekeeper, looked up in shock as Nora descended the staircase. The red mark on Nora's cheek told its own story. But Nora said nothing. She pulled her coat tighter around her and stepped out into the rain. William stood frozen in the bedroom. His anger should have burned itself out, but instead it twisted into something else, an unease he couldn't name. He turned back to the bed. For months his sons had been restless, plagued with nightmares. Doctors, therapists, and 14 nannies had failed to soothe them. Yet now they were asleep. Their brows were smooth, their breaths steady. No tossing, no crying, no sweat. Just peace. William's throat tightened. His hand still stung from the slap, the ghost of the strike imprinted on his skin. He sat on the edge of the bed, lowered his head into his hands, and felt the shame seep into his chest like ink into water. On the nightstand lay a folded note. He reached for it and unfolded the paper. "If you can't stay for them, don't push away the ones who will." It wasn't signed, but he didn't need a name. William read it once, twice, a third time. Each word cut deeper than the last. The storm outside quieted into drizzle, but the storm within him had only begun. He looked at his reflection in the mirror across the room, a man hardened by grief, drowning in control, choking on silence, a man who had just struck the one person who had managed to soothe his children. He lifted his head, his eyes dark with something more than anger now, something closer to regret. But it was too late. Nora Johnson was gone, and the house was silent for the first time in months, not with grief or rage, but with something William did not know how to name. A silence that felt wrong, hollow, unfinished, like a question left unanswered. He sat alone, staring at the note, and in the quiet, William Smith began to realize that his fortress of power and pride had just pushed away the one person who might have been able to save him. William is left guilty after driving Nora away in a storm of anger. The note she left behind lingers in his mind, pulling at something buried deep. As his sons wake and ask for her, William realizes he may have made a mistake that can't be undone. The storm had passed, leaving the estate draped in damp silence. The smell of rain clung to the curtains, and the garden beyond the tall windows glistened under a faint glow of moonlight. William Smith sat at his desk in the study, the folded note resting like a brand upon the polished wood. "If you can't stay for them, don't push away the ones who will." The words gnawed at him. He had read them until the ink blurred in his vision, until his chest tightened with a discomfort he did not recognize shame. William was not a man who second-guessed himself. In boardrooms, his word was final. In negotiations, his authority was absolute. But tonight, in his own home, he felt like a trespasser in his children's world, a father whose presence brought no peace. His hand went unconsciously to his cheek, then to the faint sting in his palm. He remembered the look in Nora Johnson's eyes when he struck her. Not fear, not defiance, just stunned betrayal. She hadn't fought back, screamed, or even spoken. She had only looked at him silent, as if to say that his anger was smaller than her pain. And then she had walked away. A creak of floorboards broke through his thoughts. "Daddy." The voice was soft, uncertain. William looked up. Ethan stood in the study doorway, his slight figure swallowed by the oversized pajamas he refused to replace. His teddy bear hung limply from one hand, its stitched eye nearly falling off. Behind him, Eli peeked out, thumb in mouth curls, messy from restless sleep. William straightened in his chair. "What are you doing awake?" Ethan's brow furrowed. "Where's Miss Nora?" The question landed like a stone in William's chest. "She had to leave," he said after a pause, trying to keep his voice steady. Why Eli's voice cracked as he stepped further into the room. His wide eyes glistened, desperate for reassurance. "She didn't do anything bad." William opened his mouth, then closed it. He could not lie. Not to them. His throat tightened. It wasn't her fault, he admitted quietly. Ethan's small shoulders stiffened. "You yelled at her." William forced himself to nod. "Yes." Ethan's lips trembled. Did you hit her?" The silence between them stretched sharp and unforgiving. Finally, William lowered his gaze and whispered, "Yes." Both boys flinched. Eli turned away, his small back rigid with disappointment. Ethan's eyes narrowed, his little face older than it should have been. For months, they had been fragile, broken by their mother's death, distrustful of everyone. Nora had been the first person they had reached for, and now William had ripped her away. "I'll fix it," he said suddenly, the words spilling out like a promise to himself more than to them. "I'll bring her back." The twins said nothing, but William could see the doubt in their eyes. He watched them shuffle away, their small footsteps echoing down the hall, leaving him alone once more. Alone with the note. Alone with the weight of his own failure. The next morning, William tried to return to routine. He dressed in his tailored suit, sat through calls with advisors, and signed contracts placed neatly before him. But his mind wasn't on the numbers. It wasn't on the empire he had built. It was on the way that Ethan's voice had cracked when he asked about Nora, and on the way Eli's eyes had filled with tears. By noon, Harold the butler stepped into his office, carrying a tray with lunch. The older man set it down silently, but lingered longer than usual. William finally looked up. "Out with it," he said. Harold folded his hands behind his back. "Sir, if I may." Miss Johnson was not like the others. William's jaw tightened. She crossed a line. "She crossed it to comfort your sons," Harold replied evenly. "Forgive me, but 14 nannies before her walked out in frustration. Therapists came and went. Doctors shook their heads, yet Miss Johnson calmed them. She stayed when others gave up. That is not a weakness, sir. That is a strength." William's lips pressed into a thin line. He hated it when Harold was right. "She's gone," he muttered. "Perhaps not forever." Harold's eyes flicked toward the folded note still lying on the desk. "Not if you choose differently." William didn't answer, but as Harold left, the weight in his chest grew heavier. Across town, Nora Johnson sat on a bench outside the train station. The morning sun broke through thinning clouds, casting pale light on her worn coat. Her cheek still bore the faint red mark from the night before, but she ignored it. She wrapped her fingers around a lukewarm cup of coffee from a vending machine and stared at the ticket in her pocket. Savannah. A new city. A new start. But her heart was still upstairs in a white house in Greenwich, where 2 small boys had clung to her, begged her not to leave. And for once, she hadn't been able to say no. She blinked hard, fighting back tears. She had survived worse than this. Foster homes that turned her away. A son she had lost too soon. A world that told her she was too soft, poor, and unqualified. She had learned not to cry in public, not to show weakness. But now, sitting alone with nothing but the drizzle and the ache in her chest, the tears came anyway. A woman on the next bench glanced over, then silently offered her a tissue. Nora accepted it with a small, grateful smile. She whispered a thank you, her voice catching, then lifted her gaze to the sky. "You matter," she reminded herself. The exact words she had whispered to Ethan and Eli night after night. You matter even when others don't see it. The train whistle echoed in the distance, long and mournful. She did not move. At the estate, William stood at the window of the twins' room. The boys sat on the floor building a crooked tower out of wooden blocks. Their faces were serious, not playful. Their laughter, the laughter he hadn't heard in months, until Nora arrived, was gone again. On the nightstand beside their beds lay a sketchbook. William picked it up, flipping it open. The pages were filled with childish drawings. 2 boys holding hands under a tree. A tall house with too many windows. And a figure between the boys' arms outstretched like wings. Beneath it, in Nora's careful handwriting, were 3 words. The one who stays. William's throat constricted. He closed the sketchbook and set it down gently, as if it were something fragile, sacred. He had spent his life building empires, buying companies, and commanding respect. But here in this house, none of it mattered. His sons didn't need wealth or power. They needed someone who would stay, and he had just driven that someone away. The note still burned in his memory. If you can't stay for them, don't push away the ones who will. William Smith admitted the truth to himself for the first time in years. He was afraid of losing again, fearful of trusting someone only to have them vanish, afraid of handing over his heart and watching it shatter once more. But the greater fear, the one that twisted in his chest and kept him awake long into the night, was that he had just lost the only person who could heal his children, and perhaps the only person who could heal him. Haunted by guilt and pressured by his son's silence, William decides to seek out Nora. He finds her in a place he never expected, surrounded by children who cling to her like she is their anchor. For the first time, he lowers his pride to ask for forgiveness. The city hummed, with its usual rhythm, horns, blaring footsteps, echoing voices overlapping in an endless chorus. But William barely heard it. His driver maneuvered the sleek black Bentley through the streets of Brooklyn, far from the polished avenues where William usually walked with purpose. Today, he was a man without certainty, chasing the faint thread of an idea: find Nora Johnson. It had been 3 days since she left the estate. 3 days of silence at breakfast, of twins refusing to meet his gaze. 3 days of nightmares returning, of Eli waking up in tears and Ethan staring at the door as if expecting her to appear. Every hour stretched like a punishment. The empire he commanded suddenly felt irrelevant when his sons looked at him disappointedly. Harold had finally broken the silence. "She volunteers at a community center on Dean Street," the butler had said quietly that morning, even before she worked here. "If you wish to find her, that is where I'd look." And so William found himself stepping out of the car, raincoat drawn tight against the wind, staring at a squat brick building with faded paint and a crooked sign that read, "Brooklyn Youth Haven." It was a place that smelled faintly of chalk and damp wood, the kind of building that had been repaired too many times with too little money. Inside, laughter spilled down the hallway, children's laughter. The sound stabbed at him, raw and unfamiliar, reminding him of what he had lost in his home. He followed the sound until he reached a room at the end of the corridor. Through the open door, he saw her. Nora sat cross-legged on the floor, a half-circle of children gathered around her. They were of all ages: toddlers with sticky fingers, teenagers with wary eyes. In front of her lay a worn picture book, its corners frayed. Her voice carried through the air low and soothing, rising and falling with the story. The children leaned closer, their eyes wide, drinking in every word. One boy with a crooked smile tilted his head on her shoulder. A little girl clutched her hand tightly. William stood in the doorway, rooted. There was something about the sight, something that cracked him open. In her presence, the children were calm, steady, safe, just like Ethan and Eli had been. It wasn't a trick. It wasn't a performance. It was simply who she was. She hadn't seen him yet. He cleared his throat. The sound startled the children. A few turned their heads curious, while others shrank closer to Nora. Her eyes flicked up and froze. For a moment, silence fell. Her expression shifted from surprise to guardedness, her back straightening. "Mr. Smith," she said finally, her tone cool. "What are you doing here?" The children sensed the tension. A volunteer guided them gently toward another activity in the next room. Nora closed the book and rose to her feet. She didn't step closer. She didn't smile. William, who commanded boardrooms and bent CEOs to his will, suddenly found himself awkward. His tongue felt heavy. "I came to apologize," he said. Nora blinked. "Apologize?" He nodded once, his voice quieter now. "I was wrong that night. I let my anger speak for me. I shouldn't have raised my hand. I shouldn't have raised my voice. You were helping my sons and I punished you for it." Her eyes searched his face, as if weighing the sincerity of his words. Then slowly she shook her head. "Do you know what that moment felt like?" she asked, her voice steady but trembling. "To be struck in front of children who trust me. To be cast out like I was nothing, after everything I gave." William flinched. "I know," he admitted, "and I regret it. I regret it more than I can explain." Her gaze didn't soften. "Words are easy, Mr. Smith, especially for men like you. I'm not asking you to forget," he said, forcing himself to meet her eyes. "I'm asking for a chance to prove it, to make it right." For the first time, his voice broke. "My sons haven't slept since you left. They look for you in every corner of the house. They—" He stopped, his throat closing. He pressed his hands against the edge of the doorway, grounding himself. "They need you. And, if I'm honest, so do I." The words hung in the air heavier than stone. Nora's breath caught. She hadn't expected that. She had seen only William the billionaire for weeks, cold, distant, prideful. But here, for the first time, she saw something else. A man stripped of armor, clumsy in his vulnerability, terrified of failing the only people who mattered. Silence stretched between them. Finally, Nora spoke. "If I return, it won't be as your employee. Not just a nanny to be ordered and dismissed. If I return, it will be as someone who has a say in their lives, as a partner in their care." William exhaled slowly. "Then come back as that." Her brow arched, disbelief flickering in her eyes. "You'd accept that I'd accept anything," he said. His voice low. "If it means my boys can laugh again." For the first time since that night, her gaze softened just a little. She studied him for a long moment, then glanced at the children chasing each other in the hallway. She thought of Ethan's wide eyes, Eli's trembling hand. She thought of the note she had left behind, the words that had been more for herself than for him. "Don't push away the ones who will stay." Perhaps she realized this man was trying, fumbling, failing, but trying to be one of those who stayed. "All right," she said quietly. "I'll come back, but on my terms." William nodded. "On your terms." Her lips curved, not into a smile, but into something cautious, fragile. "We'll see if you can keep that promise." As she gathered her things, William stood in the doorway, the weight in his chest shifting, not gone, not light, but different. For the first time since Rebecca's death, hope stirred. and it came not from his wealth or empire, but from the woman who had stood in the middle of his grief and dared to stay. Nora agrees to return to the Smith estate, but refuses to return to her old role. Instead, she sets down new rules that force William to rethink what family means. At first, the changes unsettle him, but slowly, the mansion feels less like a mausoleum and more like a home. The Bentley pulled into the long driveway, tires crunching softly over the gravel. The estate rose before them like a cathedral of glass and stone, its windows gleaming in the fading light. To anyone else, it was breathtaking. It looked like a fortress to Nora, grand, cold, suffocating. She drew her coat tighter around her as she stepped out, clutching her worn leather bag. William walked beside her, his stride steady but uncharacteristically quiet. For once, he wasn't dictating terms or filling the silence with orders. He opened the door and allowed her to step inside first. The moment she crossed the threshold, she felt the air shift. The twins had been waiting. Ethan darted down the hallway with Eli close behind, barefoot in their pajamas. "Miss Nora." They shouted in unison, their voices cracking with joy. They collided into her legs, nearly toppling her, their arms wrapping around her with a fierceness that startled even William. Ethan buried his face in her coat, while Eli clung to her hand as if afraid she would disappear again. "You're back," Ethan whispered. "Yes, sweetheart," Nora said softly, crouching to their level. "I'm back." William stood a few feet away, watching the scene with an expression that flickered between relief and unease. He had expected gratitude, maybe smiles. He hadn't expected devotion. His sons didn't just like her, they needed her. And she, he realized, needed them too. That evening, the five of them sat at the massive dining table. Plates of roasted chicken and vegetables lay untouched before the boys, who wriggled impatiently in their seats. Nora glanced at William, then cleared her throat. "If I'm to stay," she began, "things have to change." William arched an eyebrow. "Change?" She nodded firmly. "This house is too quiet, too rigid. It feels like a place where children are tolerated, not loved. That has to end." His jaw tightened. "And how exactly do you propose I change it?" "First rule," she said, her tone steady. "Meals are eaten together. No exceptions. No more dinners taken alone in your office with a glass of scotch. The boys need to see you with them at this table every night." William opened his mouth to protest, but stopped when Ethan's wide eyes darted toward him, hopeful. He exhaled slowly and gave a curt nod. "Second," Nora continued, saying, "they get a voice in this house. Not final say, but a voice. They've lost enough already. They need to feel seen, heard." William leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "They're children. They're grieving children," she corrected gently. "And grief doesn't vanish just because they're young." He didn't respond immediately. His instinct was to argue, but deep down her words struck too close to the truth. "Third," Nora added, her gaze softening as it landed on the twins' bedtime changes. "No more sending them off with the staff. You'll be part of it. A story, a prayer, a kiss goodnight. Something that tells them they are not alone." The silence that followed stretched long and tense. Finally, William set down his fork with deliberate precision. "You're not afraid to make demands, are you?" "I'm not demanding," she said quietly. "I'm protecting them. If that's too much, I'll leave now." Her words carried no malice, only truth. And for the first time in years, William found himself cornered in a way he couldn't escape, not by shareholders or rivals, but by a woman who refused to let his sons suffer in silence. He glanced at the boys. Eli's thumb hovered near his mouth, his eyes wide and uncertain. Ethan sat straighter, holding his breath as if waiting for a verdict. William cleared his throat. "We'll try it your way." The boys gasped, exchanging quick smiles. Nora's shoulders relaxed, though her eyes remained watchful, as if measuring his sincerity. The first test came that very night. At 8:30 sharp, Nora shepherded the twins upstairs with William following reluctantly. He felt awkward, out of place, as if he were intruding on a ritual that wasn't his. Nora handed him a book, Goodnight Moon, its pages well worn from countless readings. "You read," she whispered. He hesitated, then sat on the edge of Ethan's bed. His voice, usually so commanding in boardrooms, faltered as he began. "Good night, room. Good night, moon." To his surprise, the boys leaned closer, their eyes fluttering with drowsy comfort. Both were curled against their pillows when he closed the book, breathing evenly. Nora tucked them in, then turned to William. "See, it doesn't take wealth. It just takes you." Her words lingered long after she left the room. Over the next week, the mansion began to change. The dining table, once a place of silence, now echoed with laughter and chatter. Ethan proudly recounted his day at school. Eli asked endless questions about the world, and Nora encouraged every word. William listened, at first stiff and unsure, but slowly began to answer, to share stories of his boyhood that surprised even himself. Bedtimes transformed too. William sat on the floor beside the beds, reading stories he hadn't touched in decades, sometimes falling asleep in the armchair while the boys dreamed. Nora would peek in each night, her eyes soft with something unspoken, as she watched him with his sons. But it wasn't just the children changing. It was him. The mansion felt alive again, for the first time since Rebecca's death. One evening, as William passed by the music room, he heard something he hadn't heard in months: piano keys. He entered to find Nora seated at the grand piano, her fingers gliding across the ivory keys with practiced ease. A lullaby floated through the air, tender and bittersweet. The twins sat on the rug, leaning against each other, lulled by the melody. William stood in the doorway, transfixed. When she finished, Nora looked up, startled to see him. "Sorry," she murmured. "I didn't mean to intrude." "You didn't?" He said, his voice softer than he intended. "That was Rebecca's piano. I haven't heard it played since she—" He trailed off. Nora's eyes held his for a moment. Then the house heard music again. Something in his chest tightened, not with grief this time, but with gratitude, and something dangerously close to longing. Later that night, William sat in his study, staring at the fire. He realized the fortress he had built around himself was cracking. Nora had walked back into his home, not as a servant, but as a force. She had brought rules, yes, but also life. She had forced him to face his sons, his grief, his silence. And though he would never admit it aloud, he was glad she had. William Smith felt the faintest hope for the first time in years, and it terrified him. As the Smith household begins to heal under Nora's new rules, William notices that behind her strength lies something fragile. One quiet evening, she finally reveals the truth about her past, the child she lost, and the grief she carries. Her vulnerability draws them closer, forcing William to confront not just his son's pain, but his own. The days slipped into a rhythm William hadn't known in years. The sound of laughter at dinner, the rustle of pages during bedtime, even the clumsy notes of the piano filling empty halls each moment, chipped away at the silence that had once smothered the mansion. Once shadows of children, Ethan and Eli, bloomed with every passing day. And yet, even in the warmth of their transformation, William couldn't shake the feeling that Nora carried a shadow of her own. He saw how her smile sometimes faltered when she thought no one was looking. He noticed it when the boys hugged her too tightly, and she closed her eyes, as if clinging to something invisible. There was a heaviness in her gaze, a grief familiar enough for William to recognize, though she never spoke of it. One evening, after the boys had fallen asleep, William found her on the back terrace. The night was incredible, the sky clear and scattered with stars. Nora sat on the stone bench near the garden, her cardigan wrapped tight around her shoulders. A mug of tea steamed gently in her hands. He stepped outside quietly, the crunch of gravel under his shoes breaking the silence. Couldn't sleep. She glanced up, startled, then shook her head. Just needed air. He sat beside her, not too close, not too far. The silence stretched comfortable at first, until curiosity pressed him to speak. You've done more for my boys in weeks than doctors and therapists did in months. You carry them as if... He hesitated, searching for the right words to understand their pain. Her fingers tightened around the mug. For a long moment, she didn't respond. William began to think she might ignore the question altogether. But then softly, she whispered, I do. He turned toward her, but her gaze was fixed on the stars. I had a son, she said, her voice barely audible. His name was Micah. The name lingered in the night air like a prayer. He was 3. She continued, her words trembling. Bright eyes, curls that never behaved. He loved fire trucks. Always begged me to sing him to sleep. Her throat caught, but she forced herself to go on. He got sick. Pneumonia. I didn't have insurance, and I couldn't afford the hospital he needed. By the time help came, it was too late. Her eyes glistened, though no tears fell. She had told herself the story enough times that it had calcified into something she could recite without breaking. But still the pain was there, stitched into every word. William's chest constricted. He thought of Ethan's nosebleeds, Eli's nightmares, and how helpless he had felt even with all his wealth. And here was Nora faced with the same helplessness, but without resources, without support, carrying a loss he could barely imagine. I'm sorry, he said, and the words felt inadequate. Nora shook her head. Don't be. Losing Micah broke me, but it also taught me. I learned how children grieve, how they fear being left behind. It's why I knew what Ethan and Eli needed, why I stayed when others gave up, because I promised myself no child under my care would ever feel abandoned like Micah did. Her voice cracked on the last words. She pressed the mug to her lips, but her hands shook. William reached out instinctively, steadying it before it spilled. His hand lingered over hers for a moment longer than necessary. Their eyes met. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. Then Nora pulled her hand back gently, as if afraid of crossing a line. I shouldn't have told you all this. It's not your burden. It is, William said firmly. If you're carrying it here under my roof while caring for my children, it's my burden too. The intensity in his voice surprised even himself. He wasn't a man who shared burdens. He wasn't a man who allowed himself to feel another's grief. But something about Nora stripped away the distance he clung to. She looked at him, truly looked at him. And in her gaze, he saw recognition of his own wounds, of the emptiness left by Rebecca's death, of the fear he tried to bury under power and pride. You still wear it, she whispered. Your grief. His jaw tightened. Yes. And your sons feel it even when you try to hide it. He exhaled slowly, the truth of her words pressing heavily on his chest. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of loss and understanding, and something fragile was forming between them. Finally, Nora rose, wrapping the cardigan tighter. We should get some rest. As she moved toward the door, William spoke softly behind her. Micah would be proud of you. She froze her back to him. A single tear slipped down her cheek, unseen by him in the dark. She whispered, I hope so, and stepped inside. Later that night, William lingered in the study. The fire crackled low shadows dancing against the walls. He poured himself a drink, but let it sit untouched. His thoughts were consumed not with contracts or markets, but with the image of Nora on the terrace, her eyes full of pain, yet still burning with strength. He had thought she was merely a caretaker, someone who happened to calm his children. Now he realized she was something more, someone who understood brokenness, not from a distance, but from within. And for the first time in years, William wondered if healing was possible, not just for Ethan and Eli, but for himself. Just as the Smith household finds balance, the Hollands' Rebecca's wealthy parents challenge William's fitness as a father. They see Nora as an intruder and use her past against her. Courtrooms replace laughter, and William and Nora must decide how far they will go to protect the boys and each other. The storm arrived not with thunder, but with an envelope. William was in the library signing papers when Harold, his butler, entered with a silver tray. On it sat a single cream-colored envelope, stamped with a courthouse seal. From the clerk's office, Sir Harold said gravely. William slid it open with a practiced hand, expecting another mundane notice. Instead, as his eyes scanned the words, a chill ran through him. Petition for custody. Filed by Eleanor and Charles Holland. He reread the lines, but he was slower this time. His late wife's parents, the boys' grandparents, were suing for guardianship of Ethan and Eli. His chest tightened. The room seemed to shrink. He barely noticed Harold retreat quietly, leaving him alone with the document that threatened to upend everything. Nora was in the playroom, crouched on the carpet, building a tower of blocks with the twins. Eli cheered every time it wobbled higher. Ethan strategized, pointing out where the weak spots were. Their laughter filled the air like sunlight. Then William entered. His face was pale jaw, rigid. Nora knew instantly something was wrong. "Boys," he said gently, "why don't you show Harold your masterpiece in the kitchen?" They groaned in unison, but obeyed, carrying their crooked tower out the door. When the room was empty, William handed Nora the petition. She read quickly, her heart sinking with every line. The accusations were brutal. William was unfit, the household is unstable, the children were neglected, and Nora unqualified a danger, an interloper. Her hands shook as she lowered the paper. "They're trying to take them away." William's voice was steel over my dead body. The following days blurred into meetings with lawyers, gathering documents and preparing for war. Reporters caught wind of the case, splashing headlines across tabloids. Millionaire father accused of unfit parenting. Mystery nanny at center of custody scandal. Nora hated the word nanny. It reduced everything she had given her heart, her soul to a paycheck. But she kept silent, focusing on the boys, shielding them from whispers and flashing cameras. At night, when the estate finally quieted, William found her in the study poring over journals she had kept since arriving. Detailed notes of Ethan's progress, Eli's nightmares easing, and their drawings together. "You don't have to do this," he said softly. "Yes, I do," she replied, "because they'll try to paint me as an intruder. But this," she held up Ethan's crayon sketch of her holding his hand, "is proof I'm family." Their eyes met, and William felt something shift inside him. Nora wasn't just fighting for the boys. She was fighting for him, too. The first hearing was held on a gray morning in the county courthouse. Marble floors echoing footsteps, the sharp scent of polished wood. William walked beside Nora, both dressed in muted tones, he in a tailored suit, she in a simple navy dress. Across the aisle sat Eleanor and Charles Holland. Eleanor's pearl necklace gleamed like armor, her stare sharp enough to cut. Charles leaned on his cane, his expression cold. They didn't acknowledge William. They didn't even glance at Nora. When the judge entered the room, hushed, papers rustled, pens poised. The battle began. The Hollands lawyer painted William as a grieving widower, spiraling into neglect. "He cannot manage alone," the attorney declared. His reliance on an unqualified caretaker, Miss Nora Johnson, whose tragic past raises questions, demonstrates his incapacity. Nora's name hung in the air like a curse. Whispers spread through the courtroom. She sat, rigid fingers laced tight in her lap. Then William's lawyer rose. Calm and deliberate, he countered with records of therapy sessions, school improvements, and above all, evidence of Nora's impact. "The boys sleep now. They laugh. They thrive not because of institutions, but because someone stayed when it was hardest." The judge's gaze shifted to Nora. "Miss Johnson, would you like to speak?" Her legs trembled as she rose. She hadn't prepared notes. She didn't need them. "I don't have degrees in child psychology," she began, her voice steady despite the pounding in her chest. "But I know what it's like to lose. I know what it's like to be a child begging someone to stay. When I came here, Ethan and Eli were broken, not because their father didn't love them, but because grief had stolen their trust in love itself. Little by little, they let me in because I stayed, because I didn't run." She turned toward Eleanor, meeting her icy gaze. "Family isn't blood. Family is who shows up, and I'm not leaving." The courtroom was silent. Even the judge leaned back, studying her with something unreadable in her eyes. That night at the estate, William found Nora in the nursery. The boys were asleep, curled together under a blanket. She stood by the window, arms folded, staring into the dark. "You were incredible today," he said softly. She shook her head. "I was terrified. And still you stood." Her lips curved faintly, but her eyes shimmered with exhaustion. "What if it's not enough?" William stepped closer, his voice low, certain. "Then we fight harder. Because they're not taking my sons, and they're not taking you." The words slipped out before he could stop them. Her breath caught. Their eyes locked, heat sparking in the quiet. The world outside the courtrooms, the headlines, the accusations, disappeared momentarily. But then Nora turned back to the window. "We should rest. Tomorrow will be worse." William wanted to protest, to take her hand, to promise more. Instead, he stood beside her, silently watching the moonlight spill across the sleeping twins, holding on to the fragile truth between them. This fight wasn't just about custody. It was about love. The custody battle reaches its climax. Eleanor and Charles Holland unleash every weapon they have, even dragging Nora's past into the open. William must face his darkest truth before the judge, and Nora must decide if she will let her scars be seen. Together they learn that family isn't defended with perfection, but presence. The courthouse loomed under a slate sky, its columns cold and unforgiving. Inside, the air buzzed with tension. Reporters crowded the steps outside, their cameras flashing as William and Nora entered with their lawyer. Ethan and Eli stayed home with Harold, shielded from the chaos. But their voices echoed in William's mind. "Don't let them take us away." He adjusted his tie with restless fingers. Beside him, Nora patted her navy dress, simple, her chin lifted despite the storm swirling around them. They entered courtroom 5. The Hollands were already seated. Eleanor looked immaculate, her pearl necklace catching the light, her lips pressed into a thin line. Charles sat stiffly, his cane angled beside him like a weapon. When the judge entered, silence fell. The bailiff announced that this court will now hear final arguments regarding the custody of Ethan and Eli Smith. The Hollands' attorney went first. His voice was sharp and rehearsed, and each word was calculated to wound. "Your Honor, these boys have endured enough trauma. Their mother is gone, their father unstable. Records show emotional outbursts, incidents of neglect, and even physical aggression in the home. Is this a safe environment for children? He gestured toward William. A man consumed by grief cannot raise sons alone. And who has he chosen to lean on? Not trained professionals, not family, but a woman with no credentials, a woman whose tragic history of losing her own child demonstrates not resilience, but recklessness. The words landed like stones. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Nora's hands clenched in her lap. She forced herself to keep breathing, her gaze fixed forward. The attorney pressed on. Miss Johnson's presence proves dependency, not stability. The Hollands are prepared to offer these boys material security and the structure and legacy their late mother would have wanted. Eleanor's chin lifted proudly, as if the verdict were already hers. Then it was William's turn. His lawyer rose, but William touched his arm. "Let me," he said. The lawyer hesitated, then nodded. William stood slowly buttoning his jacket. His voice carried not with polish, but with raw honesty. "Your Honor," he began, "I won't pretend I haven't made mistakes. I have. I let grief hollow me out. I failed my sons in those first months after Rebecca died. And in that weakness, I hurt someone who had only tried to help. I struck Nora." A murmur swept the room. Nora froze, her heart pounding. She hadn't expected him to say it, not here, not in front of everyone. But William pressed on. His gaze didn't waver from the judge. That moment shamed me. It still does. But it also changed me, because Nora stayed. Not for me, for Ethan and Eli. She stayed when no one else could reach them. She taught me what I had forgotten, that my sons don't need control, they need connection. They need presence. And because of her, I began to show up again. He turned slightly, meeting Eleanor's cold stare. The Hollands believe family is blood, legacy, and appearances. But my sons don't need appearances. They need love. They need the woman who held them when nightmares broke their sleep. They need the man who learned to be a father again through her. His voice cracked, but he didn't look away. I am that father. And Nora is not just a caretaker. She is family. For a moment, the courtroom was utterly silent. The judge leaned forward. Miss Johnson, will you approach the bench? Nora's knees shook as she stood. She walked with deliberate steps, each one heavier than the last. Miss Johnson, the judge said, you've been portrayed as both savior and liability. I need to hear from you directly. Why should this court trust you with these boys' lives? Nora drew a deep breath. Her palms were damp, but her voice was steady. Because I know what it means to be left behind, she said. I was 11 when my foster family decided I was too much trouble. They packed my things in a trash bag and drove me to a shelter. I know the look on a child's face when they believe they don't matter. I saw it in Ethan and Eli, and I refused to let them carry it alone. Her eyes stung, but she went on. Yes, I lost my own son. That grief will never leave me. But it taught me something. Love isn't about guarantees. It's about staying even when it hurts. Even when it's inconvenient, that's what I've done. That's what I'll keep doing. She turned toward the Hollands, her voice soft but unshaken. You think I don't belong because I don't share their blood. But I've shared their pain, and that matters more. When she stepped back, William's eyes followed her, pride blazing in his chest. After a recess, the judge returned with her decision. This court does not take custody challenges lightly, she began. The Hollands are respected members of this community. However, Guardianship is not about wealth or legacy, but the environment that best supports children. Her gaze shifted to William and Nora. Ethan and Eli have flourished under their father's care. Not perfectly, but meaningfully. The testimony of Miss Johnson demonstrates not liability, but extraordinary dedication. This court sees no grounds to remove custody from Mr. Smith. Petition denied. The gavel struck. Eleanor gasped fury, twisting her features. Charles placed a hand on her arm, whispering, "Let it go." But her glare burned across the aisle, promising the war wasn't over. William exhaled, shoulders sagging with relief. Nora closed her eyes, a single tear sliding free. Outside, cameras exploded with questions. William shielded Nora with his arm, guiding her to the car. Neither spoke until the doors shut, the world muffled. Then William turned to her. "You saved them. Again." Nora shook her head. "No. You stood up today. You told the truth." He reached for her hand, hesitant at first. She didn't pull away. "They're ours," he said softly. "And so are you." Her breath caught. She wanted to believe him and lean into his words' warmth, but fear still lingered, the fear of being temporary, of being left again. Yet when his thumb brushed her knuckles, something inside her loosened. Nora imagined a future for the first time since Micah's death. Not perfect, not without storms, but real. She whispered, "Then let's keep fighting, together." William's grip tightened, steady and sure. And for the first time in years, he felt not just like a man defending his children, but like a man building a family. With the custody battle behind them, the Smiths feel they have a true home. William and Nora grow closer, no longer hiding from their feelings. Just as peace settles in, Nora discovers she is pregnant, not with one, but 2 children. The revelation shocks them both, yet it also promises a future neither dared dream of. The estate felt different after the judge's ruling. It wasn't simply quieter, it was lighter. The boys ran through the hallways with carefree laughter, their footsteps echoing not with fear but joy. The kitchen, once a sterile space for staff, now smelled of pancakes on Saturday mornings. Even the piano in the music room sang more often, its melodies spilling into the air like sunlight. For the first time in years, William could breathe without the weight of grief pressing on his chest. And he knew why. Nora. It wasn't just her presence, though, that was enough to soften the mansion's hard edges. Her strength, resilience, and how she looked at his sons as if they were hers. The way she looked at him, too, hesitant, cautious, but with a warmth that unsettled him in ways he hadn't felt since Rebecca. One evening after dinner, William found her on the terrace again. This time, she wasn't clutching tea or gazing at the stars. She was laughing real, unguarded laughter, as Ethan proudly displayed a crooked drawing of a dragon he had made. Eli tugged at her sleeve, demanding equal praise for his lopsided house. William stood in the doorway watching. The sight carved something profound in him that felt dangerously close to happiness. Later, when the boys had gone to bed, he joined her in the kitchen. She was rinsing dishes, her hair loose around her shoulders, sleeves rolled up. "You don't have to do that," he said softly. "Do what she asked," smiling faintly. "Wash dishes. You've already done more than enough." She glanced at him over her shoulder. "It's not enough. It's about being part of something. That's all I ever wanted." Her words hit him harder than she realized. Before he could stop himself, he stepped closer, his hand brushing lightly against hers as he reached for a plate. She stilled her breath, catching. "Nora," he murmured, his voice low. "You're not just part of something. You're the reason it exists." She turned, then, eyes wide, heart hammering. And in that fragile moment, William closed the distance. His lips brushed hers gently, almost reverently, as though asking permission. She didn't pull away. The kiss deepened slow but sure, carrying all the unspoken words between them. Grief, forgiveness, longing, hope. When they finally parted, her cheeks were flushed, his breath uneven. "William," she whispered, uncertain. He touched her cheek, his thumb soft against her skin. "Stay. Not for them. For me." Her eyes glistened, but she nodded. "I'm not going anywhere." Weeks passed in a rhythm neither had expected, but both cherished. The estate was not just William's fortress, but their home. Nora's laughter blended with the boys'. William's footsteps no longer echoed in solitude, but joined in shared routines, family dinners, bedtime stories, evenings spent by the fire. Then came the morning that changed everything. Nora had been feeling odd, fatigued, lightheaded. She brushed it off as stress, the aftermath of the custody trial. But when she collapsed briefly in the garden, clutching her stomach, William insisted she see the doctor. Now she sat in the small clinic, her hands cold against her lap. William sat beside her, his large hand enveloping hers, steady despite the storm in his eyes. The doctor returned with a gentle smile, holding a sonogram. "Miss Johnson, congratulations. You're pregnant." The words hung in the air, unreal. Nora's heart raced, her breath shallow. She looked at William, whose eyes widened in shock. But the doctor wasn't finished. "And not just with one," she added, placing the sonogram in Nora's trembling hands. "You're carrying twins." Nora's mouth parted in disbelief. Her gaze dropped to the black and white image, two tiny lives side by side. Her throat tightened. Memories of Micah surged, grief mingling with awe. For years she had carried emptiness. Now life bloomed again inside her, not one but two. William sat frozen, the weight of the news settling like thunder. He had walked into the clinic prepared for anything but this. Slowly he turned to Nora, his voice hoarse. "Twins," he whispered. "Again." Her eyes met his, searching, uncertain. "William, He shook his head, cutting her off gently. His hand covered hers, firm and steady. "No, don't apologize. Don't fear this. This isn't a loss. This is a gift." Tears spilled down her cheeks as she whispered, "I don't know if I'm strong enough." "You are," he said fiercely, his gaze burning into hers. "You've carried my sons through their darkest days. You've taken me. You can take this, and I'll be here every step." For the first time, Nora let herself believe it. That night, they sat together in the nursery, the twins asleep in their beds, unaware of the miracle unfolding. William held the sonogram, his thumb brushing over the faint outlines of the tiny shapes. "I never thought I'd have this again," he admitted softly. "A chance to start over. An opportunity to love like this." Nora leaned against him, her head on his shoulder. "Neither did I." He turned, pressing a kiss to her hair. "Then we won't waste it." The fire crackled softly. The boys breathed evenly in their dreams, and in the quiet, William and Nora held on to the fragile, beautiful truth that from loss, something new had grown. And this time, they wouldn't let it slip away. Nora's pregnancy brings both joy and fear. When complications threaten her health, William must decide whether to step away from his empire to protect the woman he loves and the family they are building. Together they face the truth. Love is not about control, but sacrifice. The news was filled with fragile joy the weeks after Nora's pregnancy. Ethan and Eli, once haunted by nightmares, now whispered eagerly about becoming big brothers. They tiptoed around Nora with exaggerated care, offering her their favorite toys, so the babies won't get bored inside. William found himself smiling more often than he ever thought possible. His empire still demanded him endless calls, meetings, investors pressing for expansion, but he began to set boundaries for the first time. When Ethan asked for help with homework, he closed his laptop. When Eli wanted to play catch in the garden, he removed his jacket and joined him. And at night, when Nora rested with her hand on her growing belly, William sat beside her, reading aloud, as if the babies could already hear his voice. But happiness has a way of drawing shadows. It began subtly. Nora grew more tired than usual. She brushed it off as normal pregnancy fatigue. But one afternoon, as she carried a laundry basket upstairs, she gasped, her hand flying to her stomach. The basket tumbled down the steps, and she collapsed into the nearest chair, pale and trembling. William found her moments later. His heart lurched at the sight of her sweat beading on her forehead. "We're going to the hospital," he said, his voice firm, brooking no argument. The doctor's words were careful, measured, but heavy. "Miss Johnson, twin pregnancies are always at a higher risk. Your blood pressure is elevated, and we've noticed early signs of preeclampsia. You must rest. Strictly. No exertion. No stress." Nora nodded weakly, but her eyes flicked to William. She didn't have to speak. The fear in her gaze said it all. "What does this mean?" William demanded. "It means she needs support," the doctor replied. "And you need to prepare. The next few months will be critical." Back at the estate, William turned into a man transformed. He rearranged his entire life. A private nurse was hired. The guest room became a recovery suite, with soft lighting and bookshelves stocked with Nora's favorites. Meals were prepared carefully, and her diet was monitored. But it wasn't just logistics. William himself changed. Meetings were postponed, deals delegated. His board grew restless, warning of risks, but William silenced them with one sentence. "My family comes first." Nora noticed. She would wake in the night to find him still at her side, a hand resting protectively over hers. She saw him gently guiding the twins when they grew too loud, teaching them to respect the quiet their mother needed. She heard him on hushed phone calls, refusing billion-dollar opportunities so he could be home by dinner. And yet guilt gnawed at her. One evening, as rain pattered against the windows, she whispered, "You can't put everything on hold for me." William looked up from the book he'd read aloud to the twins. "Why not?" "Because your company, your empire, it's who you are." He closed the book, meeting her eyes with quiet intensity. "It used to be. Not anymore. You the boys, these babies, that's who I am now." Tears welled in her eyes. "William." He took her hand, gently pressing it against his chest. "I've spent my whole life building something that meant nothing without love. I won't make that mistake again." Despite precautions, the weeks tested them. Nora's health wavered. Some nights her headaches grew so severe she could barely keep her eyes open. William stayed up cool cloths against her forehead, whispering reassurances even as fear gnawed at him. Ethan and Eli clung to her through it all, their little hands resting on her belly, whispering secrets to the siblings they had yet to meet. "Don't be scared," Miss Nora Eli whispered, once his thumb slipping from his mouth. "Daddy says he'll fix everything." Nora's heart broke and healed all at once. "Your daddy already has," she whispered back. One night, as autumn winds rattled the windows, William sat alone in the study. The firelight flickered over stacks of documents, the empire he had built calling him back. He knew he could delegate only so much. If he didn't return soon, rivals would circle like sharks. But upstairs, Nora lay fragile yet strong, carrying their future. He stared at the flames torn. Harold entered quietly. "Sir, forgive my boldness. I've served this house long enough to know wealth can be rebuilt. A family once lost cannot." William closed his eyes, the truth searing into him. The next morning he walked into the boardroom, his executives bristling with frustration. He raised a hand, silencing them. Effective immediately, he said, his voice steady, "I'm stepping back. I'll remain the owner. However, Marcus will handle day-to-day operations. My family needs me." The room erupted, protests flying. But William didn't waver. He chose not profit, power, or love for the first time. That night, when he told Nora, she shook her head, overwhelmed. "You gave up everything," she whispered. He cupped her face gently. "No. I finally chose everything that matters." Her tears spilled freely as she kissed him slow and deep, the kind of kiss that tasted of gratitude, fear, and hope. In that moment, neither doubted whatever storms came, they would face them together. The week stretched on, complex, but full of quiet victories. Each doctor's appointment became a small celebration. The babies grew stronger. Nora, though weary, found peace in the constant presence of the man who had once pushed her away, but now stood unwavering at her side. And William discovered a strength he hadn't known he possessed. Not the strength of control, but of surrender. One night, as he lay beside Nora, his hand resting gently on her belly, he whispered into the quiet, "I was afraid of losing again. But now I see. Love isn't about avoiding pain. It's about choosing to stay, no matter what." Nora turned, her smile tired but luminous. "Then stay, William. Always." He pressed his forehead to hers, their breaths mingling, their hearts steady. And in the stillness of that night, surrounded by the fragile promise of new life, they both knew they had passed the test, not just of survival, but of love. Months of fear and waiting led to a night filled with both pain and miracle. Nora gave birth to healthy twins. Overwhelmed, William finally understands what choosing love over everything else means. With Ethan and Eli proudly standing by, the Smith family begins again, stronger than ever, sealed not by legacy or bloodlines alone, but by love freely chosen. The winter night was hushed, snow falling softly over the city like a benediction. Inside the hospital, however, silence was impossible. The air was urgently thick, nurses rushing monitors, beeping voices sharp with instructions. Nora gripped William's hand so tightly, her nails dug into his skin, but he didn't flinch. His other hand brushed damp hair from her forehead, his voice steady, despite his heart thundering. "You've got this," he whispered. "I'm right here. Always." Her face contorted with pain, but her eyes locked onto his. "Don't let go. Never," he vowed. The hours blurred. Sweat shouts the unbearable rhythm of waiting, until at last a baby's cry pierced the air. Then another. Two voices, strong and insistent, filling the sterile room with the music of life. Tears streamed down Nora's face. William bent to kiss her forehead, his own eyes wet. "Twins," he whispered, awe breaking his voice. "You did it." The nurse laid two tiny bundles in Nora's arms, one swaddled in blue, the other in soft cream. The babies squirmed, their cries softening as they nestled against her warmth. She looked down at them, overwhelmed, as if holding a piece of heaven. William leaned close, his arm encircling her. For the first time in years, he felt whole. Back at the estate, Ethan and Eli waited anxiously. Harold had tried to distract them with cocoa and stories, but their eyes remained glued to the clock. When the front doors finally opened, and William walked in with Nora beside him, carrying the babies, the boys raced forward. "Are they okay?" Ethan asked breathlessly. "Can we see them?" Eli begged, bouncing on his toes. Nora crouched carefully, revealing the bundles. "Meet your brother and sister," she said softly. The boys' faces lit up. Ethan leaned closer, his voice a whisper. "They're so small." Eli reached out hesitant. "Can I hold them?" "Not yet." William chuckled, his voice warm. "But soon. You'll be the best big brothers they could ever have." For the first time, the mansion's grand foyer rang with the sounds of 5 voices: William, Nora, Ethan, Eli, and the new twins, a chorus of family. Days passed in a whirlwind of sleepless nights and tender chaos: bottles, diapers, lullabies at dawn. The twins, though tiny, filled the estate with more life than all the chandeliers and artwork ever could. One evening, as snow dusted the windows, William entered the nursery to find Nora rocking both babies. Her hair was loose, her face pale from exhaustion, but her eyes glowed with love. He stood in the doorway watching. A memory of Rebecca flickered her smile, her laughter, but it no longer felt like a wound. It felt like a blessing that had led him here to this moment. Quietly, he stepped forward, taking one baby from her arms. "You don't have to do it all alone." Her lips curved. "I know. That's the difference now." He glanced at her, his chest swelling with emotion. "Nora, I've spent so long thinking love was something to be earned or controlled or feared. But you showed me it's simpler. It's staying. It's a choice. And I choose you every day for the rest of my life." Her breath caught. "William." He shifted the baby to one arm and pulled a small velvet box from his pocket. Opening it, he revealed a ring, simple, elegant, a single diamond that gleamed in the soft nursery light. Nora's eyes filled with tears. "Marry me," he whispered. "Not because the boys need you, not because the twins need you, but because I do, because I can't imagine this life without you." The babies stirred softly, as if sensing the moment. Ethan and Eli peeked from the doorway, their faces glowing with anticipation. Nora pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, then nodded, her voice breaking. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." The boys erupted in cheers, rushing forward. "She said yes," Ethan shouted. Eli grabbed her free hand, beaming. William slipped the ring onto her finger, then kissed her deeply, sealing a promise years in the making. The wedding was held in spring, in the garden that had once felt barren. Now it bloomed with roses and tulips, the air fragrant with new life. Close friends and staff who had become family gathered, watching Nora walk down the aisle with Ethan and Eli on either side, the twins cooing in Harold's careful arms. William stood waiting, his heart pounding, his eyes never leaving hers. When they spoke their vows, there were no grand speeches, no elaborate metaphors, just truth. "I promise to stay," Nora said. "I promise to choose you. Always," William replied. And with those words, they sealed their love and the family's future that they had fought so hard to build. As the celebration faded and the children slept that night, William and Nora stood on the terrace. The stars glittered above, reflecting in her eyes. His arm wrapped around her waist, and her head rested against his chest. "Do you realize," he murmured, "this house used to feel like a tomb? Now it feels alive." She smiled softly. "Because you let it." He kissed her hair, his voice steady, "Because you brought it back to life." In the quiet that followed, the only sounds were the steady breaths of the children inside and the rustle of spring leaves. And William Smith, once a man broken by grief, finally understood love was not about avoiding loss. It was about building something worth losing. And he had, forever.